Hello and welcome to Fresh Thinking by Snowden Optiro, a podcast where we delve into the technical aspects of the mining industry. My name's Tarrant Elkington, General Manager for Snowden Optiro here in Perth. Today we're going to talk about a topic that's hopefully interesting to our listeners. I think it should be for quite a few. And we're delving into what it really means to sign off on a mineral reserve or an ore reserve. And maybe we'll just use the word interchangeably, use the word reserve. And joining me for this conversation is Allan Earl, who has signed off as a competent person for many ore reserves in the past and brings a vast experience in that space, including 40 years in the mining industry across a range of commodities and mining methods. In over 25 years now of consulting, or nearly 30 years of consulting. So thanks, welcome to the podcast, Allan.
Thanks, Darren.
I guess maybe we could just start really simple and see what does it actually mean to sign off on a reserve.
Well, thanks, Tarrant. So when you sign off, you're stating professionally that the reserve is reasonable, that it's appropriate, and that it's defendable. Because a reserve isn't just the tons and grades that you're reporting. What you're reporting across is the whole value chain, from geology through mining, geotech, metallurgy, hydro, pricing, environmental constraints. They're all layered together, and basically your signature is representing your professional judgment across these layers of information. And really, if you're challenged, and typically that'd be by your professional association, you need to be able to explain and defend all the assumptions used in the reserve. So a reserve is the outcome of professional decisions. It's not just the mine design and data compilation.
And I guess it's have you seen, is it common for one person to be that competent person, or for a reserve, or multiple?
I would say in most cases, the practice is for a single competent / qualified person to be signing off on the ore or the mineral reserve, and usually, in fact, in all cases that I've come across, it's the mining engineer, the person that's supervised or physically, actually put together the geology, the geotech, the scheduling, develop the economic model, and put it into a single mine plan. And really that makes practical sense. Well, there needs to be one integration point, and it's usually at the mine planning stage where all these factors, or modifying factors that we'd call them, are put together. But it does mean that one person is carrying the weight of all those factors across the whole reserve value chain.
Yeah, it's a pretty important role to have, and one that I guess comes with a lot of responsibility, right? So what if I'm signing off on a reserve, or you are, what are you actually taking responsibility for?
So really, you're taking more than just the mine plan and the numbers. You're taking responsibility for all the modifying factors that go into the reserve. So, from geotech, the metallurgical modifying factors, the throughput rates, dewatering assumptions, capex and opex assumptions, importantly, the metal price assumption, ESG permits and constraints, and so on. So really, everything across that reserve value chain. So you may not have generated those numbers yourself, but you're owning how they're applied in the reserve.
And you don't have to be necessarily an expert in each of those individual items in order to.
No, no. So you can rely on specialist input, and the codes do recognise that. But what you need to do is apply critical review to those inputs, to those specialist inputs. They're outside of your immediate area of expertise, which would typically be the mining engineering aspects, the mine design and scheduling aspects.
So if you brought these specialists in these other areas, um, you know, that doesn't necessarily shift your responsibility, right? It's obviously a useful thing to do and something quite a reasonable, uh, thing to do is that, we should have experts in their areas developing these things, but that doesn't reduce the responsibility that you have as in signing off on the reserve.
No, no. Reliance doesn't transfer responsibility. So if you have a single reserve, competent, qualified person, then responsibility stays with you.
Yeah. And you talked before about critical reviews. So what you need to do around these other modifying factors to satisfy yourself. That you'd be comfortable to sign off on the reserve. So what does that really? What does doing a critical review actually mean?
So it certainly doesn't mean redoing the specialist work. You're not
Yeah.
qualified or competent to do that. But it means applying informed professional judgment on these inputs. And so, you could ask the question: are they from a reliable source? Not simply a number sort of generated to give you one of the important modifying factors from an unknown source. You need to know the source and know that's reliable. Are they suitable for an ore reserve? So these studies need to be at a PFS or FS level, as required in the code. And are they internally consistent across that value chart? So in my experience, I sometimes see some of the sort of long lead inputs, which could be ESG, dewatering, and so on, maybe relying on old or outdated plans. So they all need to relate to the mine plan that underpins the reserve. And perhaps you don't need to look at everything. What you want to look for are those modifying factors that'll have a material impact on the ore reserve, on the tons and grade, or on the economic value.
And I guess in your, I mean, it's interesting to hear about your experience, and you've generated these and reviewed these from others, right? Where do you think that uh, competent or qualified persons maybe get it wrong or underestimate the risks involved?
So I think typically this will be there'll be factors outside the competent person's area of expertise. So it might be sitting in metallurgy, where small changes of recovery might have a material impact on the revenue and impact on the economic viability test for that ore reserve. It may be in environmental or social constraints that should have constrained the schedule or excluded areas that are included in the schedule and the reserve. So yeah, typically for areas outside of the competent person's area of expertise.
And I guess the consequences of getting it wrong are quite, can be quite significant, right?
Well, you're signing off that to the market that the reserve is reliable and can be relied upon. So the consequences are you know, on you professionally.
Mm.
So as well, the board is responsible for the report, but ultimately, it's a competence person's responsibility for that ore reserve. And as I said, um, reliance isn't equal to responsibility.
And so if, people were thinking about signing off on a reserve themselves or whatever, obviously there's certain like requirements that vary via the codes, and maybe we won't delve into those. But from a perspective of somebody that does have the relevant registered professional organization of the right experience, what are the things that they should be thinking about as to whether it'd be appropriate for them to take on the professional risk of signing off on it?
I think you need to ask yourself a few questions. Um, can I defend this reserve and all the material modifying factors under peer review? Um, am I comfortable to explain the pricing assumptions? And for some commodities, the pricing assumptions might be quite technical, and perhaps even defending gold prices in this current climate of rapidly escalating gold prices could be challenging. You have to ask yourself: have I documented why I accept these inputs, and make it clear that you've gone through a process of critical review rather than simple blank acceptance of a value to use in your modelling. And mainly, would I attach my professional reputation to this result in 5 years' time?
Yeah, and I guess it is quite an important thing, and you know, it probably comes from the person's level of comfort probably comes from seeing these sorts of things, over and over, and seeing what can go wrong, what goes right, um, But if you don't feel like you've got that comfort to be able to assess what is material for this project and assess these modifying factors, then it's probably not something that you should be doing, right?
Yeah. So I see competent persons with 20, 25 years experience are very comfortable in this space. They've been in the industry long enough to understand that whole value flow. However, engineers, I guess I can say young engineers with that minimum 5 years experience and perhaps, only one job and now thrown into the role of being the competent person or the qualified person may not necessarily have that sort of value chain width of experience um, that someone with 20 years of experience would have. And of course, between that range, there's a whole that whole grey area as one gains experience. But yeah, I guess the risk largely lies, professionally at that sort of 5 to 10 year experience
And
and competent persons.
and I guess from what you're saying, it's not just about being a really good mining engineer in inverted commas to do this, right? And having been a mining engineer in this commodity for 5 years is about the accumulation of the experience that you've developed as a understanding mining operations projects and so on, to be able to give you the ability to assess or critically review those modifying factors.
I think without exception, projects that I've reviewed in the last 5 years, that the mining engineers are very competent, and the tools they have to work with these days are excellent. But what I see is perhaps a limited understanding of the role of the competent person or the qualified person, and an understanding of the codes that they're reporting to. And so, but as their level of experience increases, their understanding increases as well.
And I guess maybe we'll wrap this one up and we'll maybe talk about some other aspects in later podcasts. But I guess in conclusion, what I'm hearing is that a competent or qualified person, when signing off on an ore or mineral reserve, needs to take ownership of what they're doing. They can't just rely. Somebody's just written a report. Okay, tick. Metallurgy has been done. You need to understand what's going on and form your own, do your own critical review, right? And that, so before people get into that space, they should really understand that it's not just ticking a box. It's not just, putting a signature on a form. There's a lot more stuff that goes behind it that people need to appreciate in doing this critical review. And it's important review to do in order to take responsibility for these things.
That's correct. And I think simply I would say that if you sign it, you own that responsibility.
Yeah. So thank you very much. I think that's a good closing message, and great to have you here on the podcast and sharing your knowledge. I hope you enjoyed the podcast. If you did, please subscribe to the podcast. We're available on all podcast and podcasting platforms, and we look forward to sharing future podcasts with you in the future.